The year is 2025. Cities hum with anxious electricity. Headlines flicker with the twin shadows of unrest and calamity. Governments posture, coastlines swell with storms, and the world seems to breathe as if waiting for a held note to break. In that hush, an older voice stirs, not from a pundit or a think tank, but from 5 centuries ago. His name is Nostradamus. Imagine a small study in Saint-Remy de Provence, dim light drifting through a mullioned window, a table thick with vellum and ink, a man bent over a quill. Michel de Nostredame wrote in a time of plagues, wars, and trembling thrones. He wrote as if listening through the world's seam, plucking phrases that bent and doubled back on themselves, shaped like mirrors that only reveal an image when you stand at the right angle. Now, in an age of satellites and instantaneous news, those mirrors are being looked into again. Lines first laid down in 1555, cryptic quatrains stitched in French, Latin, and Greek, are being unfurled and threaded onto modern events, the tremors of an economy, the sudden fury of a storm, even the collapse of familiar certainties. Some read Nostradamus as a prophet. Others read him as a poet whose deliberate obscurity invites every anxious eye to find its reflection. Whichever camp you belong to, one truth remains simple and unsettling. Words that were inked by candlelight have a way of echoing across centuries. They arrive here, in 2025, as both warning and lullaby, a cadence that soothes while it unsettles, asking us to listen closer. The question that slides under our skin is small and persistent. Did he merely write for his own time, or did his lines reach forward, like soft footprints, into our own restless age? Michel de Nostredame was born in 1503 in the sun-baked town of Saint-Remy de Provence, a place of ancient stone and slow, drifting light. He trained as a physician, tending the sick in an era when plague and superstition moved like seasons. He mixed medicines and formulas, read the courses of stars, and cultivated a reputation that blurred the line between science and sorcery. In 1555, he published Les Prophecies, a book of more than 900 quatrains that would, across centuries, become both a cultural curiosity and a loaded instrument for the anxious mind. Those quatrains are unlike the tidy forecasts of a weather report. They are compressed, elliptical, and often wrapped in classical and biblical echoes. Nostradamus wrote in a mosaic of languages, vernacular French splintered with Latin and Greek. Each quatrain is short, a tightly wound stanza that refuses easy translation. Read plainly, they offer fragments, a city, a name reduced to a shadow, an image of fire, or a brief, haunted phrase. Read attentively, they open into a dozen possible meanings. Part of his power is intentional ambiguity. Where a modern analyst might seek time-stamps and precise coordinates, Nostradamus offers metaphor and metaphor's slipperiness. He gives us great floods and earth-shaking fire rather than GPS coordinates. He gives archetypes rather than dates. This means his verses can be bent to many shapes. But it also means that when a moment arrives that resonates with the imagery, a sudden war, a headline about a market collapse, a devastating storm, readers reach back and find a quatrain that seems to fit. The quatrains are a kind of mirror. The image you see depends on the light you bring. Yet to dismiss him outright as mere vagueness is to overlook the texture of his life. He was a man formed by calamity. He treated the ill, watched societies falter, and lived within a Europe that was constantly remaking itself. His writings emerged from that pressure. Whether you call him a seer, a skilled rhetorician, or a trained observer who couched his insights in mythic language, Nostradamus remains a compelling figure because he wrote in a way that invited future listeners to take part, to interpret to fear and to hope. Among the many interpretations of Nostradamus's quatrains, a handful have become threads for those who look specifically to the United States, a nation that, despite being centuries younger than his Europe, has become an attractor of prophetic speculation. 3 lines of interpretation appear most often, those that speak of catastrophic urban disaster, economic collapse, and social unrest, and extreme climate events. Each is anchored by the kind of images Nostradamus favored: vast, elemental, and disturbingly intimate. The great city is Astor. One quatrain, Century I-87, has been read by some as a foretelling of a major city in the New World beset by catastrophic destruction. The words often quoted, earth-shaking fire from the center of the earth will cause tremors around the new city, carry volcanic weight, a center burst of violence or devastation whose shockwaves reach distant shores. For some interpreters, the quatrain is retrospectively linked to tragedies like 9/11s. For others, it points to a future coastal calamity, a storm surge, a breach of levees, a rupture of infrastructure, something sudden and ruinous that remakes a skyline overnight. The image is not precise. It is a word picture of a city whose order is shredded by elemental force, economic collapse, and social unrest. Century 828 speaks of gold and silver diminishing and discord among brothers, phrases coalescing into a vision of economic contraction, followed by civil division. In modern readings, those lines are folded into anxieties about volatile markets, growing inequality, and political polarization, a recipe by which financial stress becomes social rupture. To read Nostradamus this way is to see a domino. Currency and wealth falter, confidence collapses, and the social fabric strains under the weight of fear. Unprecedented climate events. Another quatrain, Century I-46, speaks of the Great Flood, long rain, famine, language that resonates powerfully in an age of rising seas and intensifying storms. Where a reader in the 16th century might have envisioned seasonal disasters within a familiar pattern, a 21st century mind maps these lines onto statistics: longer, more frequent droughts, sudden, catastrophic flooding, crop failures. The quatrain doesn't name greenhouse gases or industrial development, but it sketches, in timeless imagery, a world where the weather no longer behaves within predictable bounds. There is an insistence, among those who connect Nostradamus to modern America, that these lines are not mere coincidence. They point to a pattern, a series of threats that together could fracture a nation's sense of security. To critics, the link is speculation layered on selective reading. To believers, it is a cold, patient music from the past, a voice that, regardless of one's belief in the supernatural, seems to anticipate the anxieties that now define our present. A serious conversation around Nostradamus must be willing to lean into its own uncertainty. Historians and literary scholars point out a fundamental fact: Nostradamus wrote in a style designed to be opaque. Ambiguity was his instrument. That opacity allows an extraordinary elasticity of meaning, the kind of elasticity that lets a single quatrain be cited as proof of vastly different events separated by centuries. Scholars often argue that this is not prophecy, but projection. People in later centuries, confronted with modern calamities, retroactively fit Nostradamus's lines to the events they fear most. This process, confirmation bias dressed in the garments of scholarship, is familiar. Humans are pattern seekers. We crave narrative. If a line contains a phrase about fire and a modern disaster involves flames, the connection is made and repeated until it becomes, in popular consciousness, a line of evidence. Yet the dissenters are not unanimous. There are researchers and enthusiasts who insist that the frequency and specificity of certain matches exceed mere chance. They catalog correspondence and argue that, while not every quatrain is revelatory, a surprising number touch upon themes that later become historically visible. This camp tends to treat Nostradamus a different kind of intelligence, not one that functions like a clockmaker's precise mechanism, but like a radar that discerns atmospheric shifts, broad, directional, and occasionally uncannily accurate. Between these poles sits the public, readers, documentarians, and casual internet wanderers who engage with Nostradamus according to temperament. For some, the quatrains are a playground for speculative anxiety, a comforting myth that makes chaos legible. For others, they are a cautionary mirror, hinting that patterns in human behavior and nature repeat with terrible persistence. What is rarely questioned is the quatrain's rhetorical power, whether seen as prophecy or poetic ambiguity. Nostradamus composes phrases that lodge in the mind. They are images of elemental threat and social fracture that, once evoked, refuse to be easily dismissed. The debate, prophecy versus selective interpretation, is therefore also a debate about narrative, about how we choose to read the past when the present is frightening. Why does a 16th century French apothecary still matter in an America of streaming platforms and algorithmic feeds? The answer folds along cultural, psychological, and media lines. Culturally, Nostradamus functions as a repository for collective dread and curiosity. His quatrains offer a vocabulary for expressing that which is otherwise incoherent: the slow burn of climate anxiety, the sudden collapse of markets, the uncanny sense that history has stilled and is repeating. When people search for explanations in the dark hours, they often reach for voices that feel older and therefore wiser. Nostradamus provides that voice, not because it speaks with clarity, but because it speaks with age. In the world of media, Nostradamus is endlessly marketable. Documentaries, talk shows, and online channels can frame his verses as cliffhangers. Books and long-form pieces sell by promising that the past contains keys to the future. In America, where the appetite for doom-scope narratives runs deep, Nostradamus becomes a familiar figure in the cultural palette, a touchstone that connects conspiracy, history, and the human longing for pattern. Psychologically, the appeal is simple. People fear the unknown. Nostradamus offers a way to name that fear, to fold it into language. Even skeptics who do not believe in prophecy can find value in his quatrains as a mirror for contemporary anxieties. For some, reading Nostradamus is a ritual of preparation, a mental rehearsal for emergencies that may never come. For others, it is an artful entertainment, a Gothic poem that delights precisely because it refuses to be pinned down. Finally, there is the civic angle. When readers interpret quatrains as warnings about economic collapse or climate catastrophe, the result can be political. These readings shape discourse and, in some instances, policy debates. Even if one dismisses prophetic claims, the cultural energy that surrounds them, the documentaries, the viral clips, the common threads, contributes to the larger conversation about risk and responsibility. Thus, Nostradamus persists not merely as historical curiosity, but as an active player in modern discourse. His words are repurposed, retranslated, and reframed by each generation that needs a language for its fears. In a nation shaped by rapid change and public spectacle, the act of turning to a figure from 1555 is less anachronistic than it first appears. It is a way of grasping for continuity in an era that feels otherwise unmoored. Whether you approach the quatrains with faith or with skepticism, one thing is plain: Nostradamus's words have a tenacious life. They ripple outward, across centuries, into podcasts and public debates, into midnight conversations and documentary voiceovers. For some they are prophecy, an eerie thread linking 1555 to 2025. For others they are a mirror that shows us our own dread with unsettling clarity. Perhaps the truest power of Nostradamus is not that he predicted specific events, but that he taught us how to listen for patterns. He gave us imagery that our modern minds can press against current anxieties, shaping them into narratives that feel comprehensible. And in a time when stability feels thin and the future seems to flicker like an unsteady candle, the act of finding a prophecy, or of dismissing one, becomes a small act of meaning-making. So the question remains, will history prove him right again? The answer will arrive one way or another, not as a single revelation, but as weathered, incremental change, a tide of events that we will stitch into a story, whether Nostradamus is part of that story or not. Until then, his quatrains will keep their place at the edge of our conversations, soft, mysterious, and inexorably human, the voice from centuries past that continues to press its quiet hand against the window of our present.